Coogs house. It's officially football season. Last season's marquee win was an upset over the Kansas State Wildcats. But now the question appears to be, did Houston break Kansas State? Evidence appears to say so.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, the daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater who came to stop by, thank you for making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. Please make sure to listen each and every day here at Locked On Cougs. If you want to join the conversation, but you don't know what to say, tell us in the comments down below what you put on top of your pizza, because I think that's what we're going to be eating around the house this week for the game. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, and August 26th is officially FanDuel Futures Day. More on that fun later, but make sure you get it on FanDuel for all the action over there. I do want to open today's episode by talking about Kansas State and how Houston appears to have broken the Wildcats. I also want to investigate if Houston should invest in getting to this game in Ireland potentially. And last but not least, part of the fun of Ireland this year was that there was a rivalry game involved. I think Houston's got a potential rival in the making. Before we get to all that, though, Kansas State appears to be broken. If you were not watching this weekend, the opening game of college football was played as Farmageddon took place in Dublin. And listen, Kansas State lost 24-21 to Iowa State. Kansas State was Houston's last win, I should point out, last win at the end of last season. Kansas State would then go on from that game last year to lose to Arizona State. A couple weeks later would lose to Iowa State, and then would barely beat a Rutgers team in a bowl game that didn't have all their guys playing because it was the bowl season. And then they opened the season with a loss in Farmageddon, which had its struthers. Now, I want to talk about how Houston did this specifically in a second, but while we're talking about our Farmageddon, Armageddon's a whole separate thing. Farmageddon, look, I should point out that Kansas State is such a bad spot. They had relatives of the quarterback, like a father and brother of the quarterback, fighting each other in the streets of Dublin, Ireland after the game. Not a great look, to say the least. Looks like some things are broken up there. And I'm sure there was an awkward flight back, to say the least. And the game itself, look, Kansas State probably played well enough to win. There was probably almost definitely a bad spot on weird terrain there at the end of the game. While we talk about Farmageddon for a second, I don't actually mind either coach going for it on fourth down right there. I do think it's interesting that we're critical of people are critical of Kleiman going for it on fourth down with Avery Johnson not getting it, but aren't critical of Matt Campbell and Iowa State going for fourth down when they did get it, because ultimately that kind of decided the game. If Avery Johnson got in first down, they might have gone down and scored, at least get the field goal or something, right? And Kansas State loses 24-21 instead. I do think, okay, look, if we're going to be critical of the play call, I don't necessarily mind going for it on fourth. I don't know this call I would have done. I'm sure it'll come up in Big 12 squad this week. That's just not what I think I would have done. I don't think this loss for Kansas State, or frankly the win for Iowa State, automatically changes the Big 12 title game. Last year, both teams in the title game were 10-2. Both teams in the title game had close wins throughout the season. Both teams in the title game had close losses throughout the season. This does kind of give Iowa State a slight edge in a direct tiebreaker with Kansas State, I guess. But there's a very real possibility that either one of these teams is 10-2, if not both, at the end of the season. I think Kansas State's schedule looks a little bit more challenging in conference, but friendlier out of it. Vice versa, obviously, for Iowa State. There are two people at far as FanDuel or buddies will tell you that are at the top of the conference. And right now it feels like Kansas State's been figured out from atop that conference. Now, look, I understand that football is, generally speaking, a copycat sport. And Houston's made some changes on defense that'll be outlined more later today. But ultimately, Houston shut down Avery Johnson. And really made him a one-dimensional dual threat quarterback, which is the way to beat him, right? And after Houston played Kansas State last year, Avery Johnson did not have a game in which he threw a over 60% completions the rest of the season. He had 59% against Houston, right? He had 70% completions in the opener, so we'll give him that. But over 100 of the yards of the 270 plus came in just two of the completions. Even if we, for percentage's sakes, give him those two completions and just made them normal, he's completing a lot of really short passes and wouldn't have had a touchdown, right? Those two bombs that kind of broken defense looking things made up most of his positive stats, right? And I guess he had more completions, but what Houston did last year to Avery Johnson was they managed to both load the box to keep him from making run reads where he tucked it and ran it, and they also made him check it down and keep it in front of him, right? They, in disguising their coverage and lining guys up and moving on snap and stuff like that, kept him from giving the run read and tucking it himself because he is a dynamic athlete. We saw it in one of his runs in the Farmageddon game last weekend, but he couldn't. He couldn't beat you over the top. He had to keep it short. And so the broken coverages obviously were when it didn't go so well. But basically, since then, you've seen a lot of teams have success against Kansas State with that model, against Avery Johnson with that model. And I do feel like, without getting into the ins and outs, and obviously Shieldwood was the defense coordinator last year, Austin Armstrong has it this year, and some of the terminology or whatever, the vocabulary around it might be shifting from one guy to another or whatever. Ultimately, I do think that Houston, from a personnel perspective, had the personnel that last year, one of the top 30 defense in the country last year, even given the offensive woes, which I do think impacts your defense in a way that is worth mentioning. And I do think it's worth pointing out that offense will be better this year. Personnel on defense, you lost a couple defensive backs, but you also brought some in, as the Trumbull Country told us one time here at Locked On Coogs. They brought in plenty of talent as well. And I feel like that's kind of this plan they've got going for these dual threat quarterbacks and forcing them into shorter stuff, and making them like kind of check, 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 check down the field for an elusive athlete that's, used to making big plays and used to making big time moments or whatever. Making them do the boring stuff sometimes is all it takes. And look, I don't mean to say that that Houston was a Big 12 winning kind of team last year. Obviously, they went 4-8. After that Kansas State game, they had a outside shot at a bowl game. They had to win 2 of the last 3 and lost all 3. Right? Totally get it. That's also flush and down the drain and out the back. Right? Like, I look at that though as a moment that was a defining moment for Houston's season last year, and may have forever altered this Kansas State team. And I don't think that that's super hyperbolic to get into. It's a little bit, I guess, but like, honestly, that team has not looked the same since. Our own Locked On host of Locked On Kansas State, Christian Rao, will tell you that their season was derailed by that a year ago, and they were never the same since. You talked to, I talked to John Kurtz in media days, Kansas State guy, covers the whole Big 12, but he's a Kansas State guy. His heart of hearts. I think he's got a 3 Mall podcast, really that too, on top of his Big 12 show. And he was like, "Yeah, man, some changed." Like he was on about last year's team. He wasn't carrying it over to this year's team, but it appears that whatever changed has not unchanged. And I think that's a credit to Houston, and frankly, a credit to Fritz and staff and company. Like last year, one of the marquee wins in Fritz's first season was beating Kansas State when very few people in the country thought it was possible. And that seems to have altered the future of this conference, honestly, in a way that I think is worth mentioning and worth um, worth praising Fritz and company from last year. I mean, it's a marquee win for the program. It was a tremendous game too. The weather added to it, and the rain and all that, and there was rain and all that in Ireland, frankly, right? So anyway, I think that in reflecting over the weekend, as I watched college football to open the first weekend of the season, as everyone did, I'm sure, right? It was awesome to see the Houston Cougar impact continue to live on in a fun way. Speaking of fun things, I think going to Dublin, Ireland would be fun. I want to talk about that in 1 second. But before we get too far, today's show is brought to you by our buddies over at Rugiet. Because, guys, look, you've probably heard of Viagra, Cialis, over the counter pills, whatever. But if you're trying to get something beyond the usual pill, it's trying to be time to be Rugiet ready. Rugiet ready is a uh, non-descriptive box kind of situation when it comes to your house. It's next generation prescription treatment designed to amplify arousal in the brain and boost blood flow. Unlike the usual pills that can take hours, Rugiet's 3-in-1 formula dissolves under your tongue and kicks in fast, on average in 15 minutes. Effects can last up to 36 hours, so you can stay confident and control for when the moment is right. Again, discreet packaging, all online, comes right to your doorstep. You can read real customer reviews. This is helping out a lot of people. Trust me, it's really helping out a lot of people. Head to rugiet.com/lockedoncollege. Use code LOCKEDONCollege for 15% off. Today it's Rugiet, RUGIET.com/lockedoncollege. Use promo code LOCKEDONCollege for 15% off. Individual results may vary with prescription treatment. Compound drugs are permitted to be prescribed under federal law but are not FDA approved and do not undergo FDA safety, effectiveness, or manufacturing review. Please visit the Rugiet website for full safety information. Parker Ainsworth Locked on Coogs here. And I think Houston would benefit from playing in Ireland. And I think this is a trip that Houston Cougar fans need to get into, the idea of potentially being on in the future. For one, I think I saw it tweeted out, and I think the tweet was tying back to a Go Cougs podcast. So I want to give credit where it was due. I think this goes back to Ryan and Brad, but there has been talk because we approached week 0 about like Houston was very realistically going to have been playing in this game at one point. People apparently were fairly certain it might happen. It was rumored to be Houston and Michigan State in the 2025 iteration of the Ireland game that fell through. A couple coaching changes happened over the course of time and all that kind of stuff, right? But that, I guess, there was some legs to that. I don't have the original sourcing on that, but I've seen it kind of trickle through with some stuff. And then I saw, I think it. I want to give credit. I think it did tie back to a Go Coogs podcast, but the 2020s iteration of the Ireland game is kind of the third major iteration of that game. Uh, Teams from college football, American college football, played in Ireland in 88, 89, 91, 96, and then again in 2012, 14, and 16. And then there were games scheduled in 2020 and 2021. Did not happen for the pandemic, but there's also been games from 2022, 23, 24, now 25, and there are games scheduled in 26 and in 27. 21 is going to be Nebraska, Illinois. 20, I should say, was going to be Notre Dame Navy. That got postponed for a later date. 21 is going to be Nebraska, Illinois. That got postponed as well. 22 finally kicked off with Northwestern and Nebraska. And 23 was Notre Dame and Navy. 24, Georgia Tech, Florida State. This year, 25 was Iowa State, Kansas State. Next year, you got North Carolina and TCU. The year after that, you got Pittsburgh and Wisconsin. That is when the deal runs through. It would have to be renewed and things go on for a 2028, 29, 30 game, et cetera, to happen. I think, though, Houston needs to push to, especially with Big 12 involvement, get in on this one. I love to play a Power 4 game out of that. Now, obviously, you've got a couple Power 4 games scheduled later. You got Oklahoma happening later. You have LSU happening later. So you got to kind of schedule around some of those. You could play 2 Power 4 schools, though, in non-conference. Why not? Or you can make it a conference game like Iowa State and Kansas State just did. I'd be a little more hesitant to give up a home game like Kansas State did in doing this. It kind of sucks to give up a home game, go to a 50-50 crowd and lose. That feels all kinds of backwards. But if this were a non-conference game, right, you kind of more of the neutral field kind of aspect anyway in some of those, especially like you're playing LSU at NRG, I believe, right? And so like theoretically NRG is already going to be a 50-50 stadium just because of how much of an LSU presence there is in Greater Houston. Not a far trip for them to come over from Baton Rouge either, right? Now, given that the trip is far, this would be a high dollar trip for fans. I don't mean to say that it would not be. It's certainly not accessible to the average fan, and I totally get the privilege that speaks with. But is the kind of thing that when you look at the programs we've mentioned, Notre Dame, Florida State, uh, North Carolina, they have Bill Belichick, Wisconsin, Nebraska. These are big time brands, right? This kind of is an exposure thing to an international audience for big time brand. Even like the smaller brands like Navy, right? Navy's got a prestige that is resounding across as a service academy across the globe, right? And so I think that that is an important aspect of this. The current iteration of these games is being played at Aviva Stadium, and that is a different. I want that comes up important in a second because since 2022, they've had 42,000 is the 42.7 thousand people in the stands has been the minimum. They had 49,000 in 2023 and then 47,000 this season people in the stadium watching the game. That doesn't count the wide-ranging international audience for the like what is this thing going on right now. There were some issues with ESPN and the UK, but generally speaking, Europe it was in their time zone, so to speak, right? Europe was able to tune in to this game. The most, though, at one of these games in person was Penn State versus UCF in 2014. Penn State, again, a big time brand, like we're saying. That's the most. It was at Croke Park, which is actually a different stadium, obviously, in Dublin. I think it's also definitely both in Ireland, but that was 2014, so it's been over 10 years ago, though, and so things continue to grow. And I think it's a fantastic exposure deal for the brand. You can take that Cougar logo, take the red and white, and take it across the pond, so to speak, and show it off in the best kind of way. I also think when we start talking about 2028, 9, 30, what you're looking at here, right, is a point where you're comfortable saying, look, if the rebuild goes well, we're going to be good by then, right? Like 2026 is Keyshawn Henderson's freshman year. I don't know if he redshirts if he plays or what happens there. We got Austin Carlisle coming in too, I mean, as a freshman this year too, right? But 2027, 8, you're feeling like, okay, like 2028 would be Keyshawn's third season, right? He would not have gone pro at that point. You aren't allowed to. You're hoping you retain him, and I think that that's a very real possibility. Loves Fritz, loves Houston, and he's definitely the starter by that point, right? Like that's the 5-star starting quarterback taking over the reins. I think that that's 28, and then 29 will be his senior year. If he redshirts, 30 would be that year. Like those are the years we're talking about when the Houston Cougar program is going to be at a very comfortable, let's show this thing off kind of place. You want to get on that schedule for those reasons. Second, I also think it's a recruiting tool. There was a mention that like 40% of the players had to get a passport to go to this game. Like they didn't have a passport before this game happened. And you can say what you want about farm boys from Iowa and Kansas, but what that really tells me is like, hey, that meant these kids got to do something they'd never done before. And you could recruit that as well. You could say, hey, listen, not only you get to play in the Big 12. You get to play in your backyard if you're from Houston, greater Houston area. You get to play with Keyshawn. You get to play with Fritz. You get to play this great system they've got set up. But also, we're giving you a once in a lifetime opportunity, like truly once in a lifetime kind of thing to go do. You're going to be the only game on TV at the start of the weekend, the noon game. It's noon, not night because of the time difference, but like it is the thing to be watching. You are the story in college football. That is your recruiting pitch in using this game. We know Brett Mark wants to take things international. He talked about getting the brand abroad with things like basketball games in Mexico and things like that. And maybe a football game in Mexico is more the vibe that is more easier because it's a bordering nation. It's easier to get there or whatever, right? But I also think it's worth pointing out, like the Big 12 just sent. You could argue, and some people would probably argue the Holy War, but Farmageddon, Iowa State, Kansas State is the biggest current rivalry in the Big 12. They just exported that to Ireland to show the league off. TCU was in the college football playoff in 2022. They got exported to go play in front of Irish fans in Dublin, right? Big brands, like we mentioned, this is an honor that I think would help Houston in a lot of ways, even if it's an expensive ticket that I probably could not afford myself. Now, if someone were to sponsor it, that'd be fantastic. Let's go. But I think that if you could get Houston into that game, it'd be a way to help elevate things as things are moving, especially if you could do it with the rival. Speaking of rivals, I got a contender for a rival that we haven't talked about yet. Has been talking about adding rivals, the Houston Cougars. But let's get to it in 1 second because first, today's show is brought to you by our buddies over at FanDuel because August 26th is officially FanDuel Futures Day, a brand new holiday for football fans who live bold and want to live for bold predictions and preseason hunches for just 24 hours. FanDuel's giving you NFL prediction deals, all kinds of deals, NFL season prediction odds. So whether you're calling your MVP, eyeing your long shot division winner, or ready to crown your Super Bowl champ before week one even kicks off, this is your moment. If you're big on CJ Stroud this season, get it on FanDuel Futures Day. If you're big on the Texans winning the South, get it on FanDuel Futures Day. If you are the contrarian and say, hey, Houston's not, go do it on FanDuel Futures Day. Parlay your division winner dark horses all together and get in on the action. Visit FanDuel app today and start planning your future bets now because Futures Day is one day and one day only. FanDuel, play your game. Parker Ainsworth, Locked On Coogs here. And look, we've explored a couple times here in the offseason, and the offseason's wrapped up now because it's game week, but that Houston needs that Big 12 rival. And part of this was taken from us, and the Southwest Conference fell apart, and Houston didn't get to make the jump, didn't get to go get a rival, right? That's the way it happened. Some of those rivals left or whatever, and da-da-da. And I think I found one. And that one is West Virginia. Look, I think that part of the fun here would be, bluntly, the epitome of culture war between Houston and West Virginia in a rivalry game, right? Rural Appalachia, I said that horribly, Appalachia, versus Houston, big city, Bayou, right? Like, both weirdly get called dangerous online. Apparently, there's a fake video going around about West Virginia being dangerous, and I think the dangers of Houston get way overblown for a lot of reasons. But those are, I guess, something that the fakeness of it, whatever, right? But you have the opposite ends of the college type of experience between going to school in the city of Houston, going to school out in West Virginia. Both are schools that like lean on history. West Virginia did dominate that final decade of the Big East, but Houston did really well in the 70s and 80s in Southwest Conference too. And while that Big East iteration of West Virginia is more recent, I think that they're comparable in terms of like how dominant those stretches were. Yes, West Virginia has other rivals, and I guess technically Cincinnati is listed as one in some places and is now a Big 12 team, but West Virginia is completely dominated in football for a long time. And when West Virginia went to the Big 12 almost 15 years ago at this point and left Cincinnati behind, it kind of killed that rivalry in a lot of ways, right? The other rivals West Virginia has, Pittsburgh, Virginia Tech, Syracuse, those are not Big 12 schools, at least not yet. And I would love to add them, but they're not yet, right? So West Virginia kind of has to go out of the conference for its own rivalries. And to their credit, they've been able to do that for a long time now, right? However, Houston is the perfect rival for West Virginia because of that back and forth, because Houston's also not a legacy member. It hadn't been in the conference as long as West Virginia, but it's not a legacy member. And for what it's worth, we've all seen Houston, when they were not a Big 12 team, go out of their way to play Tech, to play Kansas, to play Big 12 schools when they would let us play them. And that's a big, big deal. Right now, I do think, whatever you think about him, a lot of this rivalry in football would stem around like the Dana Holgorsen Bowl. And listen, Houston, if you are new to the story, air quotes, stole him, depending on who you ask, from West Virginia in was it 2019? Like they had a chance of going 10-2 and winning the Big 12 that season. He kind of folded it in those last couple of games at West Virginia. They missed the Big 12 title game. Now, people at West Virginia would say he really folded it in. People in Dana Holgorsen's camp would tell you they just weren't good enough. whatever, but they finished 8-4 when they could have gone 10-2 and won the conference. And so after that, he dips out for the Houston job, which at the time was a Group of 5 job. And that really turned a lot of heads in a lot of ways. And look, I know I was not as low on him as others were throughout his tenure at Houston. And frankly, I am not ashamed to say when Houston got him in 2019, got rid of Major Applewhite, I was like, this is things moving in the right direction, right? You take a Big 12 coach, you take a guy that brings back the memories of Case Keenum, it felt like the right thing. And so maybe that's why I stuck around with it too long. As far as being, I don't ever think I got as low on him as some people did, and I'm fully transparent on that. There were people much lower on him than I was. He did upset me with a couple things. These are comments of recruiting or his post-game comments about after Central Florida and Cincinnati about not being in the same league as them. And I was like, but y'all both came over from the American together. Why are we so far behind? Like those things did upset me. And I still think I've held on longer than most, but whatever. Dana Holgorsen coached at both schools and frankly kind of hung it up too early. Like just kind of throwing the towel too early at both schools. And so I think that both schools could kind of feel that vibe a little bit on it. For what it's worth, the only meeting between the two was that 2023 game in which Dana Holgorsen coached to a Hail Mary victory over West Virginia. And West Virginia thought they'd won the game, and then the quarterback Garrett Green throwing his helmet up in the air, celebrating because they thought they won the game with about a minute left. Him throwing his helmet up in the air cost them with a penalty. That yardage ultimately helped Houston seal the one with the Hail Mary to Stephon Boogie Johnson to win the game in walk-off fashion. And right now, like I can tell you for a fact, they're bitter about that still at West Virginia. They still feel upset about that because going into that game, all the talk was on his way out of West Virginia, Dana Holgorsen said that you couldn't win with West Virginia players. That just wasn't the thing that was going to be possible. And they kind of felt like for those 12 game seconds or whatever it was, that they had proven him wrong. And then they kind of proved him right. Right. And so that back and forth is a big, big deal. There's also, historical basketball and Huggy Bear they've got, and Houston's got Guy Lewis. They also got Sampson obviously right now and things like that. And they think they're on the right track. I like Ross Hodge. He's not horrible or anything. It is interesting to see where the programs are at in that sense. But in terms of a football rivalry, the two schools are both at the forefront of a rebuild, coming off of getting rid of a coach that just wasn't up to snuff. It's a good time. It's as good a time as any to start it. Both schools have history of being good. This isn't like picking schools at a random. I think that I would tout how historic Houston's successes are and how, they were at the forefront of integration of football in the South and things like that and whatever. But that's more me as the history teacher. I want to talk about those kinds of things as much as the rivalry here would come down to all the hype built into that one game that did involve Dana Holgorsen, and then Houston finding a way to win that game when it probably shouldn't have, and the laughing that ensued afterwards, I'm sure would play into this in a big way. I'm not saying that Holgorsen himself has to be the trophy. I do think that the country roads versus chopped and screwed or some version of the culture war in there would be a big fun part of it too, in the friendliest of ways. But tell me in the comments down below what you think. Now, last time we had a trivia question about conference titles. The Houston's won in whatever conference they were in. The answer was that they've won 11 different conference titles, 4 in the Missouri Valley, 4 in the Southwest Conference, 2 in Conference USA, and 1 in the American. I say and counting. I guess say and counting. Today's trivia question, so we'll answer this one tomorrow. Because Houston opens with an FCS school, the last time Houston played an FCS school was in 2019. And frankly, they scored 37 points, whatever. What they played Texas Southern. Who was the leading scorer for Houston in that football game? If you know the answer, tell us in the comments down below. Locked on Coogs, primer to Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team every day. Go Coogs.